Hey Fran, how are you?
Hey, how's it going? I'm doing great though. I'm not 100% sure. Jason, how can you tell that I'm me and not an AI talking to you right now?
Well, I mean, we transitioned this entire podcast to AI generation 5 episodes ago,
Wait,
so
what?
yeah, I'm not real. I haven't been real in episodes.
Oh my god. Could you have two AI talking to each other for any period of time to the point that could we make that a thing? Could a podcast be AI generated solely at this
Absolutely,
point?
absolutely. I mean, you could. Have you ever done that thing where you just like you see? I've definitely seen videos where people just shove chatbots into chambers together in the or chat rooms or I don't know
I
what you
guess
call them these
so. I guess
days.
so. Do you think it would be entertaining though?
It might be entertaining a little bit for maybe 5 minutes. I think it would
More.
get pretty old pretty fast. And I
Uh,
have major concerns about the content.
what's the over under? Use your items. Better than AI generated or worse than generated? AI generated
I don't
podcast.
know. I don't know, but it's not AI. Anyway, this is Use Your Items. We're a video game podcast about the philosophy and design of video games. My name's Jason. I'm your host, and with me, as always, is my, you know what? Submerged but not subdued co-host,
Wow.
Francisco Martin. Fran, good to have you here today. It's been a minute, I think, actually, since we recorded. That's not true, but it feels like it.
It does feel like a minute. I think a little bit of why it feels like a minute was that it's been a minute since we've done one of these deep dive episodes into
That's true.
a video game. And video game we are going to be talking about today is Soma, Soma, the spiritual successor to Amnesia: The Dark Descent.
I think it's a little bit more than a spiritual successor. I think it's maybe a logical or phenomenological conclusion.
A
It's
conclusion, even. Wow,
I
that's
mean, I want
that's.
more, but you know,
I haven't
it's
played their most recent Amnesia game, which apparently is a roguelike horror
is that
game.
true?
Yeah,
I did not
apparently the
know
newest
that.
Amnesia game is like a roguelike. You're trying to escape an area with monsters, and every time time runs out or you get caught by a monster, you get sent back to the middle of this maze or something like that.
That's that actually sounds sick. I
Yeah,
just
it does,
assumed it was
right?
another Amnesia game, so shame on me for not doing more research. Yeah, I loved Soma. I'm actually really excited to talk to you about this because we were unusually radio silent during your playthrough. So I played through Soma while you were in Japan,
Mhm.
and I played it during spooky season. I streamed some of it as well, so you may have caught some of that, but I loved it. I was thoroughly enamored, and I don't know. It's just there's just maybe it's just that I'm a big sci-fi guy, and the fantasy of Amnesia kind of sucks me out of it.
Interesting, interesting. I would say I enjoyed my time with it. I mean, not. I guess here's my spoiler-free verdict. It's just on the top. I don't think you really need to play both Amnesia: The Dark Descent and Soma. I think that if you
Absolutely
play
not. Totally
one of
agree.
those, you essentially choose at the beginning. Do you want medieval fantasy horror with some kind of Lovecraftian, Eldritchian monster looking things? Or do you want more sci fi horror and more existentialism horror and stuff like that? And pick your poison, and whichever one you think you'll enjoy more, you probably will enjoy more and probably will think is better. Um,
I might push back on that just a little bit. I think that Soma's doing very different things, but at the same
yeah,
time
definitely.
is doing this the elements of Amnesia that Soma is adapting and adopting is I think doing so in a far more mature way
Mm-hmm.
as a studio, as developers. Like they've really honed their style, their sense, their taste in Soma and Dark Amnesia the Dark Descent, which is their debut, their major debut, like Steam release, indie release, feels a little bit more like a debut release.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe
I
we should,
mostly agree with that
yeah.
from a story narrative perspective. But as we will see getting further along, and we'll get back to behind the box in a second, I
You read
do
my mind.
feel like they get a little bit lost in the sauce with the design portion of it,
Oh,
where
cool.
Amnesia does feel more like a debut, but because it's a debut, because they're more subdued, I feel like some of their design decisions were more impactful than in Soma. And that in Soma they kind of had a lot more like, oh, we have money now, we can go crazy, let's do this, let's make the sequel. And when certain things just didn't need to have that level of extraness, in fact the extraness kind of removes a bit from the gameplay. But we will get into that. Let's get behind the box, the our favorite
This is our
section of the
favorite segment.
podcast, our favorite segment. Jason, would you like to take it away?
I would love to. Thanks, Fran. Soma is a sci-fi horror game from Frictional Games, the creators of Amnesia: The Dark Descent. It is an unsettling story about identity, consciousness, and what it means to be human. The radio is dead, food is running out, and the machines have started to think they are people. Underwater facility Pathos 2 has suffered an intolerable isolation, and we're going to have to make some tough decisions. What can be done? What makes sense? What is left to fight for? Enter the world of Soma and face horrors buried deep beneath the ocean waves. Delve through locked terminals and secret documents to uncover the truth behind the chaos. Seek out the last remaining inhabitants and take part in the events that will ultimately shape the fate of the station. But be careful. Danger lurks in every corner. Corrupted humans, twisted creatures, insane robots, and even an inscrutable, omnipresent AI. You will need to figure out how to deal with each one of them. Just remember, there's no fighting back. Either you outsmart your enemies, or you get ready to run.
And run you will be doing in this game.
I I really don't love this behind the box. Like I feel like this is not I don't know, maybe it's me. This doesn't feel like the Soma that I played. Like reading these
Interesting.
paragraphs, like it
I can
feels
agree with that.
so I don't know. No shame to my marketers out there, but it feels very marketed. It feels like they ran this through the marketing team a lot to get
Yeah.
here. It feels like very I don't know. It feels almost sterile to describe like what's going on
Yeah.
in it, like
It doesn't
in
even
Soma.
mention the main character at all. Well, who are you playing as? What are you in this story? And I guess we can get started
Yeah,
just a
let's
little
do
bit of
that.
that. You play as this guy called Simon Jarrett, who is a recent victim of a car crash. He has this head injury that has some kind of, we don't get go it doesn't go really into details what the brain injury is, but essentially it's terminal. He's been given a few months to live. And because of this, he decides to go through a very, very experimental uh, research to essentially get his mind scanned. And if I understand it correctly, the idea is that they're going to scan his mind. And after scanning his mind, they're going to figure out a way for the brain to heal itself. So
I
the
believe
scanning of the
that's correct.
brain is really not the cure. It's the
It's a
essentially
tool.
cartography to figure out what the plan is or how we're gonna map out your brain. But something happens that when you go under to get the brain scan through like some kind of CAT scan, CT scan type thing. In this case, it's kind of like some kind of dentist chair looking thing.
Yep.
You wake up and you immediately have no idea where you are. You wake up in this dilapidated industrial room where things are starting to rust, things look horrible, it's dark, and you have absolutely no idea what the heck happened. And the story begins, and that's how the story starts.
Yep.
And
You're just a guy
you
who
just
went in for a routine, quote unquote. It was a little weird, but
mm-hmm.
you basically just go in for a CT or, a CAT scan or something like that, or an MRI like you would at a doctor's office. This
but
one looks a
you
little
are
different.
like, this is like super experimental. Like the guy who's doing this, you call him doctor at one point, and he's like, Mr. Munchie, I still haven't gotten my
Yeah.
my medical license. Like this is how much of the edge of like the end of the line this is for Simon. He's like, this is the
Yeah.
last choice I have here.
Well, it's even cooler because the way Frictional teaches you the controls for the game is that you wake up in Simon's apartment and you have to answer the phone and click around and move around and interact with the different objects in his apartment, like opening up a drawer. You have to click on the drawer and you have to move the mouse to pull the drawer down and stuff like that. So very, very typical sort of Frictional design where every movement you have to make to interact with the game is like very deliberate. It's not just like click and something happens. It's in a way to, I think, build some tension, but it teaches you that, and then you go to get your brain scanned. You ride on the subway in Toronto, I think.
Yeah, Toronto.
And you ride on the subway for a little bit. You answer your cell phone. You talk to your friend. You get to this office building, and it's totally closed. All the lights are off. There's nobody there. It's like really kind of freaky, and like there's cloths over furniture, and like it just doesn't look like anybody's here, and you can't find the doctor that you're supposed to meet. And like that's when they teach you to like go explore stuff, and then you have to go find documents that'll give you the code to get into the door so that you can go find where Dr. Munchie is. So
Mr. Munchie.
it's Mr. Munchie. So you really get a sense of like how far Simon has sort of gone to try and solve his terminal diagnosis. So really
honestly,
interesting
at
start.
this point, I came into Soma not knowing absolutely anything.
Yeah.
I didn't know it was a sci-fi horror story or anything or what the setting was. So going into this, I was like, oh, is this gonna be some kind of like maybe modern day hospital horror type story where some of the frictional insanity stuff is gonna come back because you have a brain injury or anything like that. And it kind of, so knowing the games that Frictional had made before kind of gave me that sense of what that is. So the hard pivot to this like industrial, like robotic, like you have no idea. I mean, the behind the box already kind of buried the lead here. It's an underwater facility called Pathos 2, which is a network of different laboratories that do research. And I think that's pretty much as much as I can give you without spoilers.
Yeah.
So what is your history with Soma?
I mean, it's kind of interesting. So, but right before I wanted to ask, are you like a horror gamer? Have you played a lot of horror games before? Is that like a genre you seek out? Like,
question.
And I feel like it's a really interesting genre because it's a little different from, like the average day shooter or something like that, especially like what Frictional's trying to do.
Yeah. So for me personally, I am not somebody who really seeks out horror games. I usually only play horror games if they are recommended. I guess if they're recommended, really is the only big reason that I play games. I know that I do have another game in my backlog called The Bunny Graveyard that I really want to play just because it is a Puerto Rico developed game.
Oh, cool.
And it's a horror game, so I'm gonna be playing it. Maybe I'll stream it, but
that would be fun.
Yeah, it's a horror game. Yeah, I'm not very much into horror because, and maybe I'll talk about it a little bit here, or maybe I'll talk about it more later on. I really do feel that horror is such a hit or miss with different types of people. It's a very difficult, in the best of cases, games to design. Even if you design a perfect horror game, I feel like only 50% of your audience is actually going to enjoy it / feel what you're actually going for. what is the major thing about horror games is that there is a very, very fine line between that you need to really walk for horror games. You want some level of discomfort in horror games, right? You want to be able that if the player is ever comfortable, then, well, you do want to give the player some comfort sometimes, so that way they're not always on edge. But most of the time, horror games want you to feel uncomfortable. They want you to make decisions that you don't want to make, so that and have that be the path forward. The issue that is with horror games is that too much discomfort or too much prolonged discomfort really quickly leads to annoyance. And that's
frustration.
A big frustration and annoyance. And this is something that happened in Amnesia: The Dark Descent, and it happened in Soma, where I know where the monster is. I get it. You don't need to make my screen staticky. You don't need to play the music that loud. Let me just turn off the music. Let me just mute the game at this point because you're just annoying me with this music. It's not really scaring me. It's annoying me at this point.
Yeah, the first two times are scary. Now it's just a challenge.
Metroid Dread, also a game that happened with me.
Man, I have so many opinions about. I got into some heated debates about Metroid Dread.
Interesting.
I loved Metroid Dread, but that's another episode, I think.
Yeah, that might be another episode. I will refrain from saying what I feel about it, so that way the audience
that could be a cool item bag for another episode, maybe.
Like just horror games in general.
Yeah, or maybe just like a revisit, like a retouch of Dread and Fusion, something like that. Okay. Because like that's a pretty unusual genre to play.
Yeah.
Like to have like a horror experience.
Yeah. So there is that level of. You need to be very careful with how much discomfort you're giving to the players, because if you give too much discomfort, then you're going to just be annoyed. And there were a few parts in Soma where I was just, I get the monster is there. Yeah, ooh, spooky. Okay, I'm running now this way and whatever. And I'm kind of done with this area. So yeah, it's I will get a little bit later on once we get into the spoiler section, which section specifically I started feeling that way. But I do feel that horror is a very your mileage may vary type game. Just because some portions annoyed me doesn't mean that they will annoy you, the audience.
Yeah. Do you think that's a function of horror genre in like horror genre video games, or do you think that's the horror genre as a whole? In that it's your mileage may vary. I can sit here and rattle off like the best horror movies ever, right? Like Friday the 13th or Halloween or something like that. And
there is a certain level. There's different for me personally. I think that there's different things that turn from discomfort to annoyance and frustration that are different in movies. I would say that in movies, annoyance starts when the characters are acting in a way that are against their self-interest. If you as an audience can immediately find an answer that the movie doesn't give you a reason for why didn't they try this, that's when you start being, okay, now I'm annoyed. Because you like in certain aspects, obviously, if it's a high tense situation where it happens immediately and you're like in the middle of something, a human nature is that you're not thinking clearly in times of high stress. That makes sense. But there are certain horror movies and media where the characters are talking about, okay, what are we going to do next? Okay, what is the plan? Okay, whatever. And then you immediately come up with a better plan than what the audience has and what the characters have, and that's annoying. Or if the characters act in a way that you feel is not, it just doesn't feel like it is comparable to what is actually happening, is I think the fine line that you have to travel. I feel like it's much easier in movies to not get you there, because movies will force you through a scene. A scene will always be X amount of seconds. regardless of how scary,
Your
annoying, or
interaction,
discomfort
your
is.
feelings.
Yes.
Yeah.
In a game, that's not true. In a game, it's might be my fault and skill issue that I stay stuck in an area for so long to the point that now I'm annoyed, you know?
Horror
Like,
diff.
yeah, horror diff. Yeah, it's. I think that it is a thing that is more prevalent in video games. That's why I'm so interested in that roguelike version of Amnesia, because that sounds like it does force the game to move forward. So
Huh.
it'll make it so that, hey, I'm out and about, the game is about to get annoying, but some ramp up system happens where you die and you get brought back to the beginning, where maybe you're still annoyed because you just got lost so much, but that's roguelike, so maybe it kind of is forgiven for that. Um, I guess we should say what a roguelike is really quickly. Roguelike is essentially a genre of game in which the basic mechanic is that each time you play the game, you restart the game at the beginning. So essentially, Hades is a very popular new one where you play the game. Noida is another one. You play the game, and then at some point you die, and when you die, you start the game over with no items, with no nothing,
Yeah.
except with some exceptions.
Right. So a roguelike it's a run-based game.
Yeah.
It's probably more akin to the experience of like a mobile game or
Mhm.
like a portable, like a handheld game might have been designed in the past, or a mobile game might be designed now, where you
Yeah.
have an individual run with a set of experiences. Slay the Spire is another great example. So it's situations where you iterate and you reiterate. I have some opinions about horror genre as a
Mhm.
whole
Go
when
ahead.
it comes to roguelikes. Like, so I know Outlast Trials is similar in design to the new Amnesia game, so that's pretty interesting to think that they both showed up. But I've played Demonologist, I've played Phasmophobia, and these are, multiplayer, social based roguelike games where you have individual runs and you go in, you have to hunt a ghost or find a demon, and you have to find clues, and you have like these clunky kind of tanky controls and all sorts of stuff. And it's always very scary the first few times, and then once you kind of settle into the game, it really just becomes another game
Yeah.
that's doing other stuff, and it starts to lose some of that luster. So
Mhm.
I think necessarily the function of a roguelike game just being a series of constantly iterative runs, especially ones where you earn a meta currency that allows you to buff and improve your future runs, rather than like a true rogue experience where you're always at zero no matter what
Yeah.
and all you get is your knowledge. I think in the roguelike horror genre, you have people who are fans of the horror genre and they want a roguelike. And the horror genre has trappings associated with it, has content associated with it that is very different from Hades, which is Greek mythology, or Astral Ascent, which is, like zodiac symbols, or Slay the Spire, which is cards and stuff. Like, it just has different vibes. And so I think when you do a roguelike, Amnesia, Outlast, Phasmophobia, Demonologist, what you're really doing is you're creating an individual horror experience that at any given moment can be very, very scary to somebody, but upon future play can start to lose some of that. It doesn't
Yeah.
make the inherent experience unscary or not scary, in the same way that just because I've seen the original Halloween 20 times doesn't mean that that movie is not still a singularly scary or horrifying movie. It's just that I have more experience with it. So
Yeah.
I have some. That's kind of my quick 1 and 2 on just like horror and the roguelike genre, sort of where they meet. I will just note I never played Soma before the show. I played Amnesia. My friends from my oldest friends, many of them are friends and listeners of the show, so thank you for being here and thank you for making me play these games. But we used to do like when the first Amnesia came out, we used to do these nights where we'd get a 6 pack and a bunch of Chinese food, and we'd go shack up at somebody's house, and we'd put somebody's computer in the living room on the big TV, and we turn all the lights off and close all the windows, and we would just do a binge, and we would play a horror game all night long. We would try to beat it in one session. And so we did that with the original Amnesia, and I screamed and I hollered and I was jumping up on the couch and I was freaking out. And it was just like, I had never played a game where a monster chased you like that, right? Like that was the whole conceit of Amnesia. There was the insanity meter, which I think in future games, like we've kind of seen, like in Soma, like it's not really a super effective tool for distributing horror in a game, but it had that sort of meter, which I wasn't crazy about, but it had a monster with a sort of generative, I guess, AI or algorithm that would chase you and find you and hunt you through spaces. And that was just like terrifying. And so that was my first experience with Frictional. And then my friends had done that for Soma at one point, and I had shown up with friend of the show, Brian, at our other friend Brian's house while they were all playing Soma, and we showed up at the very end of the game. And Fran, I mean the end of the game. Like the big
Like
titular
the
moment. Basically, like I watched them walk to the cutscene area, and then I watched the final cutscene. And then I think we played the board game Time Stories. That might have been what we did.
Wow, what a
It was like we showed up at the end of
experience.
a different group of friends hanging out, and we showed up for the next thing that was happening.
That is the level of like you got to watch. You walked in the living room when they're watching The Sixth Sense, and Bruce Willis is realizing that he's been dead the whole time. That's that level of like, wait, what
Spoilers
are you doing, bro?
for The Sixth Sense.
I mean, if you haven't watched The Sixth Sense at this point, then you're
not going to.
You're not gonna watch it. Come on.
Yeah. But yeah, so I saw the very end of the movie of the game, and I just never thought about that game ever again. I didn't know what it was about. I didn't understand the experiences that led you there. They were all like shook, and they were like, "Oh my god, like I can't believe it. That's such a wild ending. Like, of course that's how it ends, but I just can't believe it." And I'm like, "Whatever, guys. This seems pretty typical anyway. Who wants to play board games?" So it was very like disjointing, and then coming back to it in this playthrough, I was like playing it by myself in my office. I would stream it sometimes, and it was just a lot scarier. It was a ton of fun. I sort of loved the pacing of it. There were a few moments where I found the game, I hesitate to say it, frictional. And there were times where I just like butted up against the monster or the level design. I can think of two moments in particular. When you're like at the beginning of the game, there's a moment that I found very, very frustrating. And then there's one particular moment at the very end of the game that was like also frustrating. But for the most part, I found the tension to be high enough that I didn't think too much about it. And if I died a few times, I didn't have too many problems with it.
I have a question about that. What does it mean to die in this game?
In the story, like what does it mean when
what is the lose condition? Because this happened quite a few times with me where the screen went to black. I thought I died, but then you just spawn in the same spot but with a limp. Like I
think you can get a full game over screen. Like not like that, but I think I had moments where it like threw me back to a respawn.
Interesting. I never got that, and
I had what you had happen. I mean, the game also has a pacifist mode for what it's worth.
What does that even mean in the context of this game? You can't. I see. I think we'll get into that in spoilers. I think I see.
Yeah, the game does have some accessibility settings for your level of horror and what you want out of it.
Gotcha.
Like a story mode, I guess, is a better way to put it.
Multiple times just accept it, because the thing is, so viewer, the reason I ask this is that there are some times where the monster catches you, and after it catches you, the monster kind of like leaves, and you fade from black, and you're in the same spot, and now you have a limp and an annoying chromatic aberration view. But that's it. There were like 2 or 3 times where I personally was like, eh, okay, monster, just do whatever you're gonna give me the chromatic aberration, whatever. Okay, cool. Now I'm still spawned here. You left, and I can do the thing I wanted to do, and then I keep going.
Yeah.
There are a few times where that happened, and that I kind of feel like is a negative. I have to say, I guess, a negative to the game, right? If I'm actively choosing
to be caught,
just catch me. It's faster if you catch me than me running away.
Do you think, Fran, that is it your duty as a player to approach these games with a sort of intentionality that you're willing to suspend disbelief for stuff? Like, you're willing to play the game in such a way that it would be scarier, or it's closer to maybe how you think Simon might play, like almost like a role play aspect? Or do you think it's the game's job to sort of create that for you?
I think that it is. I would say, personally, I would like to be the latter. The game should create that environment and be the fun way is the correct way, so to speak, to play the game. The reason I'm saying this is that it's kind of like a DM in D&D forcing you to do something that you don't want to do, right? You're railroading a character into something. At that point, what's the point? Why wouldn't I just watch a movie if you're just forcing me to do certain things in certain ways that I don't agree with? And that's something that actually, I guess I'll get into it a little bit right now. In some of that, they got lost in the sauce. So in these types of games, in frictional games, there is this element of you can grab almost everything in the world, right? You can like grab a piece of paper, you can grab all these things. Now, in Amnesia, The Dark Descent, I feel like there were some technical limitations as to how much they could put in an environment before the game starts to drop FPSs and stuff like that. So not everything is pick upable. Like, only certain things that you see are pick upable. And given that this is a haunted, like, destroyed down castle in Amnesia, then it makes sense that there isn't that many stuff to like pick up and like to do stuff.
Sure.
In Soma, you are in a very lived in environment with a ton of stuff to pick up.
Yes.
Too much stuff, in my opinion, to pick up, to the point of sometimes the stuff would get in the way of me picking up a piece of paper to read, or B, me just forgetting that these items have use, because there's so many items that always are trying to grab your attention that this thing can be picked up, that I forget that I can throw an item to break a window. Or like later on.
Oh man, wow, that just
woke. Yeah, I know, right? We'll talk about that later.
Oh wow, that just pulled me. That just that gave me a
that's
bad
a mystery
feeling.
tool for later.
And so, like the very first thing that I did in this game, well, not the very first thing, but one of the first things that happened in this game was that Mr. Munchie says, "Oh, don't go into the other room. There are medical equipment and dangerous stuff." So naturally, me being the gamer I am, I'm like,
"You are a gamer.
I'm gonna go into the other room." So I go into the other room, and I look at a syringe, and I'm like, "Wow, this game is from the 2015." So I don't expect it to do much with this, but I'm kind of curious to see, does the game actually do something with this? So I went to Mr. Munchie, and I threw the syringe at him as if it were a dart to see what would happen.
Oh my god.
Nothing happens. I picked it up and tried to stab him. Nothing happens. So it's one of those things where in Amnesia, I don't think you ever meet anybody else that won't kill you. So there is a level of, because the story that Amnesia's trying to tell, the settings that Amnesia's trying to tell, and because of the technological drawbacks that they had, I feel like the design decision of there are a lot of pick upable items and they have certain type of uses to them, which is to distract enemies and stuff like that, becomes much more apparent and more in line with what I expected of the game. In Soma, I feel like they got lost in the sauce and were like, let's literally make everything pick upable. And to the point that it was like, oh my god, a nail gun. I wonder if I can use this to like shoot the enemy. No. Okay,
Well, yeah,
I guess
mean,
it
there's
doesn't
no
have
weapons in that in
there's
a
no weapons.
frictional game.
But in that case, just don't have those items. Or don't have those items be pick upable. Like you're starting to the more options or the more you let the player imagine things in the game, the more disappointed they'll be when they can't reach those expectations. And those promises obviously are not placed by the designer on purpose, but might accidentally be put there by them. We put too many items that you can pick up, too many things. We gave you too many toys to the point that you have now gotten distracted a bit, and therefore we can't streamline this experience for you. And that is something that happened to me with items. I think you only need to pick up items like 3 times in the whole game. And what I mean by pick up items, I mean you need to grab an item and use that item for a very specific intent to move the game forward. You could use items to distract monsters, like in the other Amnesia game, but I'm not counting that as a need to have, because technically you don't need to do that. You could like stealth your way around them.
Right. I see what you're saying. I guess I just never felt in my playthrough that I was overwhelmed by the number of items.
I don't think overwhelmed is for me personally the right word. For me, it's more discarded, where it just became part of the environment to the point that I just ignored it. It's kind of like the idea of oh my god, I didn't think we were gonna bring this up, but alarm system design, where yeah, I know, right? This is like
wow. This is a trigger warning for everybody who pays a subscription to Vivint.
So alarm system design is there are designers that specifically work to what in a nuclear fission site, what alarms are the most important ones? How do we make sure that alarms aren't a snooze button where somebody can just ignore it forever? And a lot of like systems in different places that have alarms, an alarm is ringing constantly and they just put duct tape over it because it's like it's always ringing. We have no idea why it's always ringing, but obviously nothing bad has happened and it's been ringing for like the past 6 months, so obviously it's fine. That's the type of thing that happened to me, where there's so much stuff around that I totally forgot that I could use items. I forgot I could use my items, Jason. And
that is a problem for our podcast.
That's a problem for our podcast.
I will admit. I guess, okay, so I didn't have that experience. Okay. That was not my experience. I really loved the environmental storytelling that happened. I liked all the little affectations and the pieces of lived in experience. That being said, there were moments where you were meant to use those environmental items to achieve a goal. There's one right at the beginning of the game. I don't think it's a spoiler. It's basically the first thing that happens. You wake up in the station and you have to get out of the room that you're in, and the game just says you can pick stuff up and throw it, and it doesn't say it very often, and you're meant to pick a chair up and throw it through a window to jump through it. And it is very unintuitive. It took me forever. I was getting so frustrated. That was one of the peak moments of frustration for me in the game. And So I will agree with you that there are some things that could definitely be better, and this is a moment where, you know what, it's been maligned, but sometimes I need a little yellow paint. Okay, is that so
Yeah.
much? Is that so bad?
The
Like,
dreaded yellow paint.
and we slam so many games for it, but it's like, I don't know. Have you ever tried to break the window in Soma? Because it's, if you don't know to do it, and if you're thinking about playing this game, listener, just trust me, this is not a spoiler. This will only enhance your experience. So I don't know. I found the environmental storytelling and the sort of density of items in this space to be really satisfying for the most part,
I
but but I can see where you're coming from too. I don't think your point of view is outlandish.
Yeah. I don't know if those two things need to be are mutually exclusive. Like, I don't think you can't have one
Sure.
without the other, right? Like, you
Yeah,
can
yeah.
have
I agree with
environmental
that.
storytelling without having those items like pick
Yeah.
up, you know?
Interactable. Sure. Yeah, I can agree with that. I think maybe we should touch on a little bit of game development here too.
Mhm.
It seems like we're talking a lot about their design and
Mhm.
sort of what Frictional is attempting to do here. So I'd like to touch on some of the sort of stats and the
Sure.
uh
Yeah, we could do some of the house cleaning. Okay, so Soma released in September 2015 for Linux, OS X, PS4, Windows. It was also released like a year later on Xbox One.
Yo, wait, it
Uh,
came out on Mac? That's crazy.
yeah, I know,
That's
right?
crazy that it releases on Mac.
It
That's
releases on
kind of
Linux,
wild.
bro.
Well, that I don't know. I just assumed they developed it in Linux. So,
So according to Frictional Games, Soma was difficult to make. It started development in 2010 for our math challenge. That's 5 years. It took about a year to develop new tech. I say that with quotes for their engine for stuff that was necessary for Soma. The main concept, a narrative you play through with active storytelling, required a lot of iteration and testing, many of which did not work out and required rework. By that, we mean that in Amnesia, the story kind of has already been told, and you are exploring this story,
what
something that
happened?
happened in the past. While in Soma, it is both something that happened in the past and something that is happening right now. So
Yeah.
it's not, it is you take a much more active role in Soma. Thomas Grip, the creative director, mentioned in an interview at one point, this quote is abridged. So the player will actively take part in all the important events, living through all of the plot's major moments, period. I think it is really important that it should be possible to get a general outline of the story, even if you miss all the details. Whenever possible, the player should be doing things instead of being told things. In the end, the player should be able to retell the narrative as I did this and then did that, and not just describe what happened in cutscenes.
That's a really interesting take in 2013 and
Mm,
for a 2015 release game, because I feel like a lot of what we've seen in the last, I don't know, 5 years or so. I mean, it's 2024, so I mean, yeah, I mean, basically after this happened, and I feel like there was a lot of push for this idea of active storytelling in game design, what we end up as being some of the most iconic games of this era of like the mid aughts are like the Souls likes of the world, or
yeah,
rather, I guess the FromSoft games where there is no active storytelling whatsoever in those.
yeah,
Right? Like those are games that for the most part, all of the major action in the story has already happened. You are basically playing the epilogue of a greater story in most of the Dark Souls games. And
maybe the only one is Sekiro. Maybe Sekiro is like,
sure, that's a little
not
bit
even
more,
then. It's kind of
it's
is an
kind of
epilogue.
already done.
Yeah. Never mind.
I think this is true in Nier as well, but I'll put a pin in that because I have not played it yet, and that we are going to play that for the show. It's just kind of interesting to hear Thomas Grip talk about that here, where he's really interested in visiting this place of active storytelling. My players are moving the story forward by doing things rather than sort of piecing together a story that has already happened while action is happening around them, because I feel like there's like this other current in narrative game design where we're interested in living in a space and exploring a space that has a very rich story told, and you're just given scraps.
Yeah. I think that it's a very I wouldn't even call it reactionary, nor would I call it revolutionary. I would say that this is something that shows very much creative intent. This is what they wanted to do, and that's what
I think
did.
they hit the nail on the head for
I find it
what it's
interesting
worth too in this game.
I would say
Okay.
I
Okay.
We will get into spoilers. Sorry. But I would say for the most part, yes. For the most part, I think that they were able to achieve a certain level of what they were trying to do. However, I feel from interviews and from having played the game and things like that they kind of wanted to take it further and just ran out of time. Like they weren't able to do what they wanted to do necessarily. That's the feeling that I get, at least. And if that's erroneous, maybe that's the case, and therefore that's just my experience with the game. But it does feel like there are some parts that feel like they didn't achieve what they wanted to do with certain sections. But yeah, we really need to get into story into the spoilers to talk about that. Cultural impact. Soma received generally favorable reviews. Sold 92,000 copies within 10 days, exceeding the 20,000 copies of Amnesia: The Dark Descent made in the first week. So that is 4 times as much, over 4 times as much as Amnesia. However, the total units sold for Soma up to date has been 1.1 million on Steam. Sorry, this is on Steam, this new information. And the Steam stats for Amnesia: The Dark Descent is 3.9 million units sold. Certain level of I think that there was a level of fans of Amnesia definitely bought in incredibly early to Soma because they were fans of their previous work. But it does seem like Amnesia, just so that we know, so people know, came out, I believe, in...
I want to say it was like 2009 or 2010.
Yeah, I think I have that in my notes around here somewhere. Around that 2010, 2009.
I think, on that point too, Amnesia: The Dark Descent was definitely a cultural touchstone in game design, right? Like, this is like... that nobody had really ever done like a horror game like this before, where the powerlessness of the player is the major draw of the game. Whereas, I mean, like, if you think about the sort of cultural touchstone video or horror video games before Amnesia, you might think of Silent Hill 2, you might think of the Resident Evil series, and around this time, the Resident Evil series was really kind of in a nosedive. That would be 2010, so that would put us after the release of Resident Evil 5, which was not very well received for a number... Like, that game is really flawed for a lot of reasons, excluding the fact that it's not the best Resident Evil game by the most generous review. And then Resident Evil 6 is also just like kind of like just a steaming pile, as I understand it. It's...
Yeah, I've never played it.
So I mean, I don't want to speak ill of that, but I mean, so basically, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is a gap in horror gaming that could definitely be filled when Amnesia comes out. And I think it does that. It sort of touches on the fact that, I mean, we have I was gonna say Dark Souls, Dead Space. That's another really important game that I think comes out in...
friend of the show, Alan's favorite game. He loves, well, not favorite, but loves Dead Space.
I played the first one through most of it. I was actually pretty interested in I wanted to visit the remaster, I think, that just came out.
Yeah, I've been wanting to check that out. So I'm looking up as well other games that came out in 2015, just kind of like to give us an idea of around Soma's release, to kind of give us an idea of what its competition was. Fallout 4.
Wow.
That's already
Relevant today, but
Bloodborne.
oh,
Bloodborne.
yeesh.
Metal Gear Solid 5.
Is that the one that everybody liked?
Rocket League, Splatoon, Arkham, Batman Arkham 9, Witcher 3, Wild Hunt.
This was a crazy year.
Stacked year. It was a pretty into more indie level stuff. Undertale or In the Blind Forest.
No.
It is. I now looking through
That's
these.
a
I'm
tough
like,
year for indies.
okay, I understand why people might have skipped Soma.
If you take all of the AAA releases out of that list and you just look at the indie releases, you're not having that. That is very stiff competition. Undertale alone, given none of these games are particularly long, and I worry if, like, I don't do indie games really eat each other's lunch like the way AAA games do, you know, where like they say like Battlefield games should never release on Call of Duty release days.
Unfortunately, I do think so. Depends. So it depends on. I guess it depends on are you a AA developer, indie developer? Like, are you Hades 2? If you're Hades 2,
is Frictional a AA?
Is going to eat. I would say yes, except that it's horror, and horror is usually a smaller piece of the pie. If you think about horror movies in general, horror movies make money hands over fist, like all the time, and it's because it's so cheap to make. Blumhouse making like 3 movies a year, like, and they always make money on them, like, but it is a very small, if you compare it to like Disney, right, and like Paramount and like all these different things, and sure, it's a small piece of the pie, but they're still putting on a profit. So I think it is a level of, it's a horror game. Horror games are already going to have a
captive audience.
A captive audience. Is going to be difficult for you to get outside of that captive audience. You kind of need to be like an Amnesia: The Dark Descent or a Five Nights at Freddy's or something that culturally affected the zeitgeist of the day to kind of like be out of that. It's not, unfortunately for horror games, it's not enough to be a good horror game, unfortunately.
I mean, I want to push back against that a little bit, because are you saying it's not enough to be a good horror game to sort of break out of the genre? Okay,
to break out of the genre, to make it, like, if I tell you right now, this video game out of 2015, I have no idea how it's like writing them down, if it's by order or anything like that. I guess I could do a little bit more research into it, but I don't see in this list even Soma at all.
Of 2015 releases, yeah.
It's I don't know if it's because it's September, so it's in the latter half, and this might be in chronological order.
September's still not that late for something like that.
Oh no, I found it. I found Soma. Okay, so it is on the list. So it is one of those things where, I don't know. I think that horror just gets a bad rap of unless it's a, I mean, it happens with movies too, right? Unless somebody recommends, I don't know about you, I guess maybe you are a horror buff, but unless somebody recommends me a horror movie and says it's actually a pretty good horror movie, I usually don't.
I tend to seek them out. I do like the genre quite a bit, but I also recognize that there are probably more people like you than there are like me when it comes to it. I mean, all that being said, horror is obviously a very important and meaningful genre, because we still keep making art in this, and it's not just art for art's sake when it comes to horror. There's certainly a commercial aspect to it. That being,
and also a how's it called? A critical, narratively critical acclaim to it. Like, what is the fears of the day?
Oh, yeah. I was gonna get into that.
Like, there's it's not just art for art's sake or commercialism. It's also sometimes
super important.
I have something that I want to talk about, and this is the best way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, horror as a genre is a really interesting space to look at, because like you touched on, horror is something that is attempting to touch on the cultural and latent fears of the person or the cultural group of the author. And we see that in stuff like Dracula by Bram Stoker is one of the sort of preeminent examples. And there you have like a very Victorian fear of sex, a very Victorian fear
Yeah.
of sexuality and lust and the Christian trappings that come with that. And in a way, you're sort of reflecting those shames and fears and like cultural stigmas, and you're sort of reflecting them in a mirror. And so you have, kissing turning into neck biting and things like that. And we're touching on it because it's something that people are afraid of, and people that are, or we're writing about it because people are afraid of this and they fear it. And it's very interesting and cathartic to see a story like that play out. And
Yeah.
this happens again and again and again. And we see this in wow, you have Five Nights at Freddy's in my head now. In Friday the 13th, that is a sort of horror classic from the early 70s, I believe, where the movie opens up with the killer killing a bunch of camp counselors at a summer camp who have stayed like one night past when they were supposed to leave, and they're drinking and they're having sex and hooking up. And that is sort of reflecting this generational fear over premarital sex and teenage pregnancy and promiscuity. And we're coming out of flower power and free love and stuff like that. And so horror as a genre is always in communication with the cultural sort of space that the author is occupying and is writing from. We can do horror as period pieces, and a lot of times we can have some really interesting stuff there. Haunting at Blythe Manor, Haunting of Hill House, stuff like that on Netflix is quite culturally relevant, and these tend to be period pieces in some way, shape, and form, or at least occupy some space of period piece. But we're always communicating that through a modern lens. I think something like Paranormal Activity is a really great example of this for a more, well, I guess it's modern for you and I. Maybe for our younger listeners, I don't have demographics on our age.
It's ancient.
I imagine that is very cringy in the way that maybe you might look at Blair Witch and say that, but Blair Witch and Paranormal Activity captured this fear of both found footage, right? This was like this fear of, I have the power to record something that's happening to me. This is real, and I can finally capture on film, and yet we're still powerless. Like, we have this new technology and it leaves us powerless. And
shout out to the best YouTube series of all time, Marble Hornets.
oh my god, dude. Yeah, I mean, Marble Hornets, right? Like, I think that was like such a huge cultural moment when I was in college. Especially, I was just finishing up undergrad, getting into graduate school when Marble Hornets was like really ramping up, at least on my campus, in my friend groups. I couldn't watch the videos by myself. I was terrified of Slender Man. It was like it was a very scary thing, and it's like trying to understand like what is Slender Man. Like, it's very easy to look at Dracula and say, oh, of course, this is about a Victorian Christian fear and shame of sex and lust and love and human connection and premarital and this, that, and the next. And then you look at something like Marble Hornets, and it's like, what are we afraid of? Like, what are we so ashamed of? Or what are we trying to bury? What are we trying to uncover within ourselves by exploring this element of horror? And the best horror fiction, the best horror authors and writers throughout history have always had this ability to sort of tap into the latent fears of their audience. I mean, the Samuel Taylor Coleridges, the Poes, the Lovecrafts, and you see a lot of these latent fears of both just the author, but then also the culture they inhabit, right? Like, we all know today that Lovecraft was a racist and a xenophobe, and so a lot of his text in the Mountains of Madness and all the stuff that's going on at Innsmouth and in New England is about this very latent, like, sort of New England and American, like, early modern fear of of immigrants, of people coming to coming to your cities and occupying your space. And so you have this cosmic, otherworldly horror that you can't comprehend, and we see that play out in his own personal texts, at least in Lovecraft's case. And for Poe, I mean, he was a gambling addict. Like, he was a man who had serious problems, and like I'm not saying that his texts are about gambling.
You don't write the telltale heart without being a little bit
yeah.
a little bit
Well, you have to be very I guess what you might say now is you just have to have really big feelings. It's just like opera, right?
Yeah.
Like, you don't write horror because you're feeling happy and lucky, and you write horror because you're tapping into something. And I think even in all, like, a really, like, just like a iconic horror director like Wes Craven is.
Don't know who he is. Sorry.
You do. Friday, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sure.
And a whole bunch of other host of horror movies, usually like B horror movies, like really campy. And it's like there's like a whole visual language that goes along with it. And I think you see that here too in Soma, where Frictional Studios is really tapping into what sort of stories the horror genre allows them to tell, and what touchstones we can sort of reach by telling these stories. And Soma, it's so much about this space of, what does it mean when you have a digital identity that takes on a life of itself? And that's what's happening here, is Simon Jarrett has this sort of digital identity that starts to take on a life of its own. And I think,
well, we're getting let me stop you there a second. We're hitting an hour. Let's give our spoiler-free verdict, and we will immediately go on with that, so that way we can go full on into spoilers.
Play the game. I think it's great. If you like horror games, this is certainly one that you should definitely visit. If you're not sure if you like horror games, but you really like sci-fi stories, check the game out, put it in story mode or pacifist mode or whatever it's called. You will have a great time. I've heard some really interesting reviews about the game from that perspective, but I think you should check it out if you're into sci-fi. If you like stories about sort of humanity and where we come from and how do we determine humanity, I think this is one to visit.
I think that if you like horror, you should definitely play it.
Yeah.
If you love horror, you should definitely play it. If you are so on horror, I would say, I think that it is very much, maybe Jason disagrees with me with this, but it is very much a pick your poison as to whether you want more medieval, like type horror, with Amnesia: The Dark Descent or Soma. I don't think that, unless you are a big fan of horror, I don't think you need to play both of these. Playing one of those kind of gives you the game design ideas that they're going for from a mechanics perspective. For the story, I would say the story is super interesting. I super like it. Soma, this is my hot take, I guess, for this game. Soma, I wish it was a movie. I kind of wish I had a way to just watch this, to just like an hour and a half, 2 hour, like psychological horror story, starring Simon Jarrett. As it is, as a game, I could take it or leave it. I will leave you with this as the final. This is what I wrote in my backlogged review, and my recommendation is actually a question. So here's the question. What if when you fall asleep, you're actually dying, and when you wake up, you're a new person with the same memories? Ask yourself that. Is that question interesting or scary for you, viewer or audience? If so, play Soma. That is not what the story is about, but that is in the same venue or same line, same conversation feeling that it's going for. If that honestly is something that you're like, I've already thought about this. Yes, I get these thought experiments. I've read the philosophy and existentialism, and it doesn't interest me or anything like that. Then just play Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Is my recommendation.
All right. Well, there you have it. If you are leaving us now, thank you so much for joining us. As always, We so appreciate all of our listeners who stick with us just for the spoiler free section and then go on to play the game. We'd love to talk to you about the game in our Discord. Link will be below in the show notes. As always, please join us there, continue the conversation, come interact with me, with Fran, or even with past guests like Dr. Dylan Ludeman, who was here for our episode on toxicity. So thank you so much for joining us, and we are going to go into spoilers. So have a great rest of your week and a great weekend. We love you. Bye.
Love you. And now back with Jason and Simon Jarrett's identity.
So I find that Soma is a horror game that is really interested in if you want to sort of peel it back, if you want me to start to write my 10-page graduate paper on Soma, it's going to be about the ways Soma is examining the digital identity that humans are creating for themselves in the 21st century and what those digital identities mean. And I think Soma is a little on the nose if you read it like this, where your digital identity, your brain scan is quite literally it is almost like a responsibility for it to exist, because there's an element to your consciousness that is attached to it. And so there's this sort of permanence that is attached with it, but then also this intense fragility that is associated with it. So I think in many ways you can kind of read Soma, and you can read this fear, this abject fear of your digital identity being more than just a bunch of memes you post on Instagram. It's
wait, there's more than that?
There is.
There's more to your identity than the memes I post?
I think it in some ways can kind of tie into the ways that our digital identities are more than just an extension of ourselves, but become full-on representations of ourselves and can damage, say, our character or improve our character in the real world. And I think that's because that's sort of what we start to see when Simon's brain scan is just turned on and loaded into a diver's suit that has a human body in it in the future.
Yes. Spoiler alert, that's what happens. I guess we already said the spoiler, but that is essentially what well, not essentially, that is exactly what happens. You wake up 100 years in the future, where somehow the brain scan of Simon Jarrett is imported into a diver suit with a dead body inside and some chips and some batteries and stuff like that. And all this information, by the way, that we're giving you about the story is not given to you up front. It's all bits and pieces throughout the gameplay. So we're just giving it to you straight up. But yeah,
I think this game also is really excited to have players get as much of the story as they possibly can from the environment and from sort of extraneous sources. There's stuff that you can't miss, and there's stuff that it's going to give you, and then there's some more nuanced things that it can do,
which I love. We've already talked
about this.
Longtime listeners know this. I don't always read everything. I'm sorry. I play Subnautica, and I don't know what happened to those guys on that island. They just died or something.
But that's why we have a show, is I read it, and then I tell you what happens.
Well, here's the thing, though. I read anything that I found. I did read for Soma. I was very interested in learning more about this universe and about this world. But there's two things, one of which I alluded to, and one of which I have not alluded to, that I had a bit of, like, an issue with how it was telling its story. Thing number one, I'm not gonna say that exploration and horror are impossible to coexist, but it is very difficult for them to coexist. Because horror is all about discomfort and pushing you to do things that you don't want to do. And exploration is feeling empowered to find information and to find new things that you want to find. Okay. So there was a few times where the road went in twain and I had to go left or right, and I would be like, well, I'm role playing right now, and I'm pretty sure that's the way forward, so I'm just gonna go that way. And I just went that way, and it just so happened that that was the right way. Maybe the other room had some cool tidbits and some cool lore, whatever. But that's not what I felt compelled to do, because if I am in a horror,
Right.
like if I might potentially be chased by monsters at any given time, I'm gonna go that way. As the game progressed, I kind of stopped doing that as I got sometimes a bit annoyed at the game. I was like, well, if I'm already not scared anyways, I might as well go to every single room and find every single information that I can. So as the game went on, then I kind of took on that exploratory type mindset. So that's something that I don't feel like. I'm glad that they took the non-amnesia tackle to storytelling, where it's absolutely practically no active storytelling and all back, because if that will happen to Soma, I think that Soma would not be as much of a success.
No,
as
absolutely not.
So that's thing number one. Thing number two that I did allude to about active storytelling, and this could be very much a me thing. I had a very, very difficult time understanding what the active portion of the storytelling was, because I had no clue what year it was. The game and the game does a really good job at showing you logs of like, oh, you read this and this thing was logged April 3rd, 2104. Okay, cool. But what year is it now? I look around and everything is like half rusted and broken down and all these things, so I'm guessing years, like at least
I think it
like
comes
a couple
up.
of years.
I think it's a few years after the meteor hits.
Which yeah, so a few years after the meteor hits, but it's not a few years after everybody has been around, because so the story for people who decided to venture onto spoilers is that Earth has been hit by a meteor. Pretty much the whole Earth has died. This this laboratory complex is underwater. They survive. They have they know that the meteor is coming, by the way. It's not like a out of nowhere, so they have time to plan and to like set their generators for 10 years and be like, okay, we have 10 years of life expectancy now. What are we going to do? And the solution that they come up with is, let us just grab our digital consciousness, put it onto a satellite, and launch it off into space. Yes, our physical bodies might die, our flesh and blood might wither away, but at least there is some level of humanity, some form of life now exists among the stars, solar powered for thousands of years. We will get into that a little bit of implication about that in a second. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about that time aspect, because of not knowing how long it had been. Sometimes I felt, oh, this happened like a few days ago. Oh, wait, no, this didn't happen a few days ago. This happened like 10 years ago. And that back and forth to me made it feel like I had no idea if I was an active member in this story. Like, I had no clue. Am I actually, like, are we going to just find the Ark has been launched into space? How are we going to find that the Ark has failed and has been destroyed and has been like that for 5 to 10 years and it has always been in the past? And so that level of not knowing, I kind of wish eventually, like 85% of the way through the game, eventually Simon asks Catherine, which we will explain later on who that is, what year is it? And she said, oh, it's September 2104 or whatever, which tells you, oh, okay, so this has been maybe weeks or months. But at that point, it's so far into the game that you have forgotten the exact details of everything else that has happened. You've definitely forgotten the dates of all the logs that you've read in the past. So you still have no idea of, okay, but now I don't remember if what I read 2 hours ago was logged a month ago or was logged a year ago. Like now I still don't know how active the story is going on right now. And so I had a bit of trouble with that. And that is why I'm like a little bit of more like, I kind of wish that I would love to watch a Soma movie. I would love to watch a Soma movie, which is a very weird thing for me to say that a video game would be better as a movie.
Yeah, I feel like we shouldn't put that
I
on your CV, but
yeah,
no, I
yeah. Don't please give me
I
food.
see
I need
where
food.
you're coming from, and I agree
Mm,
that I think Grip's idea of active storytelling is maybe a little, I don't want to say flawed, but I will say nuanced. I think he has a very
mm,
specific idea about what he means by passive and active storytelling, especially when it comes to video games. I agree that we're still kind of post action, and there is like a main story that you are creating as Simon and Catherine in Soma. But yeah, I can see some of that dissonance, that sort of like temporal dissonance, creating some tension. For me, that's part and parcel to what Soma's trying to do, right? So to break it down for me, the word Soma, if you look it up, is two things. One, it's a drink. It's like a very intoxicating drink. That is not, or juice. That is not what we're talking about here. We are talking about the word Soma, which means the body of an organism. And so it's a game and it is a story that is intensely interested in this idea of a whole body, of what makes up the body. And something like the structure gel creating a, sort of gluing the meat of a person back together, and then you flashing the personality of whatever you want onto the chip in somebody's brain, and now you have a body. Well, whose body is it? Doesn't matter anymore. What is a person, other than just, meat with a driver? It's just a flesh mech, if you really want to get crazy with it. So
mm.
I think this idea of this temporal dissonance between, I don't know, like, clearly this couldn't have happened yesterday because the person's body is a skeleton in front of me, or it's just like completely like partially disintegrated, or what have you. And I think that
But some of them are
some
breathing.
of them are. Some of them are hooked up to this structure gel and hooked up to this meat of the facility in a really horrifying way. And I think that dissonance, that inability to understand time, is part of the horror of Soma, because these constructs, these brain scans are sort of trapped in the final memories of when they were scanned. So they are always out of place. They are always out of time. They are always playing catch up, basically until they get on the arc. So I think there's an element of ludonarrative uh, correlation, I guess. I don't know. I'm trying to think of the opposite of dissonance, and it's not coming. Well, it's
Resonance.
not dissonance. It's resonance.
Resonance.
Yes, exactly. So I think it's a very resonant moment in the game, but I can also see, like, from the perspective of the player, like, you still need to know what's going on to be aptly
Mm.
afraid. And I certainly take your point. I think where I find a little bit of friction with you in terms of the game being better as a movie, or maybe enjoying it more as a movie, is that I found the choices that you have to make as Simon and Catherine to be both horrifying and daunting and very meaningful and moving. So, for instance, the very first major choice that I remember making is when you get to the segment where there is the mechanic whose mind is scanned into a robot who is dying and he's really hurt. And Simon is not really aware that he is that he is just, a diver suit with a dead body in it that his mind was uploaded to. He doesn't really know what's going on, and he finds this robot that is, kind of looks like one of the Boston Dynamics dogs, basically. And this robot is like in pain, is like the legs are broken, it is dilapidated, it is not working, but coming from its mouth is the voice of somebody who sounds unbelievably human. It just sounds like a person who is crying out in pain and is asking for help, and is asking Simon for help. And then the next step of that puzzle, if you will, is to move forward, you need to switch power on. And if you turn the power on, you'll electrocute the robot, which will cause the brain scan unbelievable amounts of pain. And so when you move forward in that segment, you have to kind of choose, like, am I going to cut the power to the facility and thereby make it harder for me to get out because there's a monster you have to get past, or am I going to keep the power on but leave this person in pain? And so I found like just having to make that decision to be like very difficult. Like that was like as at playing as Simon, I'm like, I don't want to hurt this robot. And I also had the experience of knowing how the game ends. So I also kind of already knew the VIG was up, where I knew what was going to happen, right? Like I knew that I was in a body, and the game is very much interested in this idea of what does your consciousness look like and what does it mean? And so killing, I can already tell you're going to tell me that you just like turned the fucking thing off and you walked right out of the room.
No,
And
I didn't know that was a decision I could make.
yeah, you can leave, you can turn the power on, and you can let him rot, you can let him just writhe in pain. And
I left him writhing in pain because I thought that was the only option I had.
when you go to repair the hydroelectric dam, you have this option of you can take the power out and basically you end up leaving the guy in pain, or you kill him by turning him off, as I believe how the choice goes, if I'm not misremembering it.
Maybe I walked past it because I don't.
That was like the puzzle, but I digress. I mean, that's not the only time something like that happens. There's also the moment where you don't get a choice, and to power another door or a system, you have to take the power out of this woman who's hooked up to a life support system that's like sort of like flesh powered by the structure gel and the WoW, and you have to pull the plug on her and kill her, and that is a physical human body.
Yeah.
And like it's just like the having to make these decisions and create these moments of tension is just like it's just not as feasible in film as it is in a game, because it forces me, the player, to be not just an observer, not just a witness to these moments, but to be an active participant. And that's where I think Thomas Grip's idea of active storytelling comes in, is that we are not the observer, where we get to say, oh, the dad in Paranormal Activity is he just went off the deep end and he did all these insane things and blah blah blah. No, I was the player controlling Simon Jarrett, and I made this decision.
Yeah. Okay, I see where I see that. I guess when playing these things, something that came up with Soma, and you kind of touched upon it a little bit about being a little bit on the nose. And I think that my issue with these decisions from an interactive media has been that either A, I didn't realize there was a decision to be made. So like the first one that we talked about, or B, I kind of felt like the game wasn't asking me to make any decisions that I hadn't already thought about in just life and general and philosophy and stuff like that, to the point that so many times, and this happened as the game went on, I just did not connect with Simon at all in the idea of what are we even? If we're just copies, are we even human? Even if I wasn't a copy, am I even human? Because I am inside of this thing. And in my head, I just don't really care about those questions in that framework.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very much of a more, you play with the cards you're dealt with. Who cares if I was a copy of something and now I'm living in this new body? This is the life I have to live, and I am fortunate enough to be alive, and I am my own person, because who you are personally, I believe, is not just your past memories, but your present and future memories. So it's like, it's the idea of an identical twin. Are identical twins not their own people? They are, like, at birth, they're practically identically, genetically the same.
Okay.
Does that mean that they're not their own? Obviously, they are their own people and their future memories
when you
and
get
things like this, you know?
Right. I see where you're coming from, and obviously it's the decisions and the present that makes just as much that matters just as much as the past. And correct me if I'm wrong, you're kind of saying that you feel like the exploration of the sort of philosophy of your brain in the jar, the idea
Mhm.
of your consciousness just being something that can be sort of copy and pasted, this feels a little contrived. It feels like
I yeah, I
you've
feel like I
already
don't
wrestled with this.
yeah, personally, and that's something that I did write in my review and backlogs. I was very much like, if you've already gone through this thought process and are kind of already know how you feel about things, then I think Soma won't give you a story that you're gonna be like, oh, this is really cool, or this is a really interesting way of exploring those ideas. Because Simon is so obviously on one side of things. Simon is on the side of, this is weird, something is wrong, oh my god, isn't this crazy? What the fuck? You know, like
Right.
he's very much on that track the whole way through, even up to the credits. Like that's how he feels. Um, so one of the big things that happens in the game twice is that you need to move
This is what I was going to ask you about.
your your personality from one body to another body. And the first time it happens, it is sold to Simon. In my head, I kind of already knew what was going to happen, but Simon is kind of
Catherine is a
not.
little manipulative here.
Catherine is a bit manipulative. She doesn't tell him the whole story because she knows that it won't do things. Catherine, by the way, is the architect of the Ark, which is the satellite that is being sent to the space. She was a researcher, and she is pretty much a very socially awkward scientist that believes that the future of humanity is in a
It's
satellite
digital.
in space. It's digital because that's all that they have left. And so at one point you need to get into another suit, a deep dive suit. And the problem is that the deep dive suit, you're already inside of a suit and you are part of the suit. Like you cannot just take off this suit. It's like taking off your skin.
You're
Like there
fused
is
to
no
it.
way. You're fused to it. So Catherine says, "Okay, how about we just digitally like move over yourself to the other one,
We're going to upload
and
your
to
consciousness to the deep dive suit.
yeah." And if you ever know, anybody who knows about computers knows moving stuff doesn't exist digitally. That is not a whenever you cut, you're actually copying with a delete like
Tied into it.
writer added onto it. So me knowing, like, there's just no way for you to move data bits from one to another like naturally to the point that all of it moves with you. So in my head, I was already kind of thinking that this is just going to be there's gonna be a me. She's just copying me over to this other body. And Simon is like, oh my god, what the fuck? And then at the end of the game, she keeps telling you, yeah, we're gonna get you on the Ark, we're gonna get you on the Ark. And honestly, she's being very manipulative, but I kind of understand her point
Yeah.
of view at this
I want
point.
to talk about
Like
this.
Simon has shown to be very reticent of the whole copying thing, but it is the only chance that some part of him get to be in the Ark. And just like Catherine says, it's a 50-50 if you're gonna wake up on the Ark or if you're gonna wake up on
Well, that's her manipulation, right? Like this is her creating a framework that Simon can understand and make
yeah.
it feel like, oh, like the reason why you woke up in I don't know, in not Theta, the reason why you woke up in Epsilon at the beginning of the game when you go from the brain scan to that is because you lost the coin flip and you're conscious, and like as if there's like this camera that your consciousness has watching it. And Simon, and this is playing directly into what Simon wants to believe, and that's why this works. And that's why I find Catherine to be such an interesting character,
Yeah.
because she's I think in some ways quite relatable, because I too found Simon grating, and I found Simon like a little annoying. I was actually talking to a friend of the show, Dylan, about this when I was playing it last year, that Simon's like kind of getting on my nerves, because it's like, buddy, like how many times do we have to do this? Like, how many times do I have to
Yeah,
keep teaching?
Catherine gets annoyed with him. It's like, I've tried to explain to you this multiple times, and you don't listen. So I had to manipulate.
It's not
you
even that
into doing
he
it.
won't listen.
Like,
He refuses to listen
yeah.
because if he listens, then he has to admit that because he's in the position where he just feels like his body from 100 years ago, oh, that died, but I'm here now. And it's like, no, buddy, that's not like there was a Simon that lived and died the 6 months that he had left or whatever in the 21st century, and then there's just a copy of you, and I can make a dozen copies of you and turn them on all at once. We go so far as to just keep reloading the same brain scan of the security officer when we get to the middle of Site Theta, and we effectively just torture the information out of him by manipulating him emotionally. And
Yeah.
right, that's just like a microcosm of what Catherine is doing to Simon, and what in some ways, if you really want to get like very meta with it, you could say that we're doing to Simon as well. But I don't think it goes quite that far. I think, to your point, that's why I was like interested in talking to you about this moment where Simon uploads his memory to, or his current scan to the deep dive suit, because he's given the choice to either keep his first, I guess, body. He can keep his consciousness in the original dive suit, asleep in the chair, and eventually he will wake up, but not until after you leave. And you can leave him effectively trapped in Theta, trapped in Omicron, and like the events leading up to that were not kind. You were getting chased by a monster, and Catherine closes the door just as you get through. And that's what Simon will wake up to. Or you can turn his power off and effectively kill him, right? Quote unquote, however you want to think about it. And to me, like, this is a decision point that a movie cannot create. Like, you can get a choice that the director gives you, that the character is given, but
you can, as a movie, you can just make it so that you don't show what the option that Simon made.
I guess, but I mean, I think by asking
level
you,
of like,
yeah, I see. I don't know.
Like, for me personally, I did not kill him.
I did. I absolutely did. Do you know what happens when you turn his power off?
What happens?
There's a failure, and you can't turn his power off.
Oh, okay.
So it's just like this moment of you tried to. For me, I felt like it was a kindness, and I wasn't able to deliver it.
For me, it is not up to me to decide. That is its own person now. That's a copy of me, but it's still alive. He needs to decide if he wants to kill himself or not. I killed. There's a part where
the
human asks you to, the last human on Earth asks you to remove her life support, and that I did because she asked me to. It was her decision. So if it's her decision, I'll do it. There's a robot that you find that you can kill, or you can just walk by and keep on moving. And I didn't kill that one because she didn't ask for it. There's a level of death and acceptance in euthanasia that I think is so important. And I don't think it's fair unless you have given your consent ahead of time of like, hey, if I'm ever in a vegetative state, you're just turn me off. That I don't think it is fair for me to take away, because at that point, that is not my life anymore. That is their life, and they need to choose if they want to live or not.
And I think that's the magic trick of Soma, is that it forces you, the player, to have to make this decision and then go through that decision process, whereas a movie just asks you to think about this stuff.
But that's the problem, I think, and this is not a thing to Soma. I guess this is why I told people in the review of like, if this interests you, play Soma because it's good for you or whatever. But if you already have come up with that thought experiment and have already come up with an answer like I had, this wasn't really much of a decision. This was more of like, yeah, why wouldn't I keep him alive and just keep moving? Like, it wasn't a really thought for me.
Interesting.
In fact, the whole story and the whole thing, I kind of low-key, the excitement I got from the story was, what do I do next? Okay, send the Ark out. Awesome. A version of me is out there. I did what Catherine asked me. I did what all the people in there. I saved The whatever lives that are inside the ark, they've gone from 10 years to thousands of years. Like, I've done my part. Now what? Well, I've killed the WoW, so that means
You
that
killed
there's
the
less
WoW.
monsters around. So I
Why
can
did you kill the
maybe,
WoW? Like, why was that your choice?
I don't know. I honestly, at that point, I don't know.
Yeah.
I just was like, will this kill the monsters? Maybe, maybe not. Okay. It was a very. This is now me getting into meta gaming. It was a very much a. If the game ends here because I died, I can just restart the game and get the other
Yeah.
ending. Like, it's not that big of a deal.
So why do you
That was
think
literally the only
in
reason.
in the same logic as you kept the original future Simon 2, we'll call him, alive,
Mhm.
why was it acceptable for you to kill the WoW? Like, what made you feel like the new form of life that the WoW had created using structure gel from
Mhm.
human remains? I think we can all agree
Mhm.
it is not humanity as maybe Terry
Mhm.
Akers and Catherine
Mhm.
Chun had intended for
Mhm.
the WoW to do it, right? So, sorry, listener, if you're unfamiliar, the WoW is the AI that controls
Mhm.
everything in this. It was installed secretly in Pathos 2, and it was designed as an AI whose sole function was to preserve humanity at all costs. And somewhere
Yeah.
along the way, like all good evil AIs are, it gets corrupted and twisted by its own logic, and it
Mhm.
decides that the best way to keep humanity alive is to pump any bodies of flesh that we can find, because consciousness is not necessary to quote unquote life. We don't care if they are
Mhm.
conscious or if they are mobile. All we care is that their heart is beating, and that's about it.
Mhm.
So it pumps all of these people full of this like structure gel, which is I guess like a nanobot sort of gel, and it
Yeah.
creates I would arguably say a new form of life. Not one that
Mhm.
is recognizable to any sort of regular everyday 21st century humans, but
Yeah, there's a few reasons why. Maybe this is me with my familiarity with AI and from the documents that we read through Soma. This was not AI this is not a data AI. This is not a data from Star Trek. This is not a an AI that has at some seems to have created its own form of consciousness in a way that human can understand or interact with. It is pretty much, like you said, a bunch of ifs and thens and generative language models that it has created to kind of get the best outcome that it can. So the reason that I felt, well, okay, like the WoW never kind of like communicated to me in such a way that made me feel this thing is alive in the way of sentience.
yeah,
I guess that's what's more important to me, not if it's alive or not. Because at the end of the day, we kill animals for food, and that is life,
sure.
right? So at the end of the day, life in of itself isn't the sacred part. It's the
It's human
sentience and
sentience.
the sentient, yeah, human sentience. I would say sentience is the most important part. I will not put human to that.
Okay.
The reason I'm not putting human to that because the argument could be made, what if the WoW was sentient, but it was a sentience that I as a human cannot understand, right?
Right.
In that case, just how nature works, I'm a human. That's what I correlate the
Of
most with.
course.
I'm going to do whatever is best for my species.
Yeah. It's
I have no
self-preservation.
idea. It's self-preservation at this point, and therefore I was like, from my perspective of like, would I have killed the WoW if this happened or not? I think so. There's also an argument to be made that you're doing this at gunpoint almost because there is a monster thing that is telling you to do it, and he could kill
Acres
you
is
if he
kind of,
wanted to. So
yeah, manipulating you
there
into
is
doing
a
it.
there's an element of this of like you're being forced to do it. So there's a bunch of reasons why I kind of did it.
Yeah,
Metagaming,
sure.
narratively, what I believe, How about you? Did you know what happens if you don't
I
kill
don't
it?
know what happens if you don't kill it. I did kill the
Mm,
WoW in my game, but that's because I
mm,
felt like what the WoW was doing wasn't. I don't think that that was any sort of life that uh, it was intended to create. And
mm,
as a, I guess I'll call it a dumb AI. It didn't feel
mm.
like you said, it didn't feel like one of those AIs. Like it didn't feel like 2001 Space Odyssey or
Yeah.
Data or anybody like that. It did feel like a program that had gone really far off the rails that was way more powerful than any program we understand. And so I actually
Yeah.
pulled up a quote here from Dr. Johann Ross from he was the only guy who worked at Site Alpha. I believe he's the
Mm.
monster that chases you through Site Alpha, which
Okay.
is
Which, by the way, I have no idea. Oh, the monster. Never mind.
yeah.
Continue.
The monster that forces you that asks you to kill the WoW is Terry Akers, or was.
Okay. Who is I? Okay. I didn't grab. I didn't understand that.
Yeah.
I didn't understand. I actually went through the whole game being like, I have no idea. I thought that was the WoW asking me to do something for it, and then it asked me to kill the WoW, and I was like, is he manipulating me into
Yeah.
doing like removing limiters or something like that, or like?
So the
But
quote from Dr. Ross is the WoW is reaching out to every machine, every life form to manipulate, to control. It is trying to help save its creators from all of this, just like the protocol demands. But really, what is good enough? Where is the line drawn for what is human and what is not? Would walking corpses do? Would a group of machines thinking they're human be acceptable? We can't trust a machine to know, to understand what it means to be. I mean, like we've said, and we agreed, the game is a little on the nose about it's sort of like trying to examine these like Cartesian ideals of, existence and what it means to be. And, I don't want to get into philosophy 101. As far as that's concerned, I am kind of enjoying this conversation on what the WoW is doing. But as far as the characters go, I do believe when you're on the crawler going on the like the elevator going down and the power blips out and Catherine turns off and you're alone, a creature swims up to you and like has this like weird like psychedelic moment with you. And Simon specifically calls out, I'm pretty sure that was Akers. So it is in the story that that's likely Terry
oh, I,
Akers.
I didn't catch
Yeah,
that.
it's a brief moment, but he's like the one that wants you to uh I'm pretty sure that's Terry Akers that wants you to kill the WoW. Maybe I'm mistaken, but
Terry Akers is the one that went crazy in Delta, the one that gouged out his eyes, isn't he?
I believe so. Now you got me confused. Sorry, listener. We know what
Which
we're
is, I
talking
guess,
about,
another
but
thing to say. There's a lot of characters in this story. Like a lot. The game does do a good job of trying to keep certain characters, and since there's so many complexes and so many areas that you explore, there are certain people, like a group of people that you will only see in one area. There's only like 3 or 4 people that transcend areas. Terry Akers is one of them. Catherine obviously is one of them.
sorry. You're right. Terry Akers is the guy who gouged his eyes out in
Yeah,
Theta. I was
yeah.
mistaken. You're right. So I'm thinking of I think I'm thinking of Johann Ross actually. Yeah,
Okay.
who yes, I am. And he's the one who he's getting you to kill the WoW. So that's my bad. I apologize.
We're getting up here at
Feeling sort of like I'm ready to wrap up. I guess
let's hit it.
a couple things I'll leave with is that this game was recommended for us by friends of the show, Brian and Steve. Thank you, Brian and Steve, for suggesting this to us. I really did love it, and I think this was a really interesting conversation that we got to sort of touch base on, and I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of these ideas, especially when we get into Nier. I think that's kind of somewhat related.
Yeah. I kind of want a sequel to Soma, which is not a horror game at all. It is a
It's
base management game, kind of like Factorio or something like that, where you're trying
It's
to
like Fallout Shelter. Put it on
exactly
mobile.
like Fallout Shelter. Like I low key when I was finishing this game, I was like, okay, I'm not that interesting in the game. The questions this game is trying to pose because I already have thought about these things. But you know what would be interesting? What would I do afterwards? Would I like? Well, I know that there's a person, one of me in Omicron. It seems like the monsters might be like calming down a bit because the WoW has been destroyed. Um, is there a way for us to like extend life here? Is there a way for us to create a new life form in that we are now all digital and the way that we procreate is you just take half of somebody's digital signature, half of somebody else's digital signature and mash them together? Like I was like starting to like, okay, how does this
You had
I'm
the
cooking
wheels
now.
going. I love you, Fran. You always have these awesome like. But what if we took this and we took it even further? Like
No,
very
this one
fun.
for the other games, I was like, okay, this is too much to ask for this game. But I think that these things that I'm saying, hey, Frictional, I don't know how much money you have in your coffers, but if you have a lot, why not try out a mobile game like Fallout Shelter called Soma Pathos 2 or something like
Pathos
that?
3.
Pathos 3.
Yeah, that's not even to say that we didn't even really touch on the whole pathos, ethos, logos
Yeah.
of it all. But I don't think
We
it's
also didn't touch on the fact that the water pressure in this game is bullshit.
all right. I mean, suspension of disbelief, man. We can't have it all. So I will let me say as we're wrapping this up, if you are interested in Soma, if you liked this game and you are looking to sort of expand your scope in other media that is close to this, something I would really recommend is a novel called Starfish by Peter Watts. It is a really interesting science fiction novel from 1999. It is about a bunch of a group of people who are stationed at the absolute bottom of the Mariana Trench in a base, and they have like a job to like maintain this equipment and stuff, and they like have like parts of their body like replaced with like mechanical pieces to withstand the pressure. I mean, obviously it's all bullshit, but very very interesting in the space of the novel, and it's a really interesting meditation on loneliness, on depression, and coping mechanisms. And there's a really cool science fiction sort of political story that's coming out of it as well. I really love that. I would also recommend, same author, I would recommend Peter Watts's Blind Sight. It was some people read it in high school, actually, I heard, so maybe you're familiar with it. One of the best first contact alien stories I've ever read. But Soma is giving me a lot. Again, he's a Canadian author, so maybe there's something in the air up there. But there is a really interesting sort of meditation, a really interesting exploration of the idea of a first contact story and what does that really mean. So if you're interested in this sort of stuff, I would definitely check that out.
Not to toot our own horn here, but if you actually want to play another game in the same idea of what is a copy, what is a replica, so to speak, Signalis, one of my top games of all time. We made an episode on it. It should have been out by this point. If you want to give it a bit of a listen for the spoiler-free section before making a decision. I personally loved Signalis. It's trying to tell other things and other stories, but it does have the same main conceit of what does it mean to be a copy of somebody else in a way that I found much more, not necessarily interesting, but much more emotionally tugging at my heartstrings rather than Soma.
Yeah, I would definitely heartily recommend Signalis. There's a lot of similar themes going on in both. I think I'd be willing to say that there's definitely some echoes between them, but for the whole, if you just enjoyed listening to this episode and you didn't listen to the Signalis episode, check that out. Check that game out. I think that's a game that everybody should at the very least watch a Let's Play of or something like that, right? Like there's a lot going on there, and it's just don't like watch PewDiePie do it because that's probably not the right vibe. I don't know if people still watch PewDiePie, but that's
I
what I
don't think
got.
he does any more video game content anymore.
Well, I mean, he did it. He did quite a bit of it. I actually watched his playthrough of The Last of Us because I didn't have a
Oh,
PS3,
I never
and
watched PewDiePie. I don't
that's
know
the only
why.
content I watched, and it was great. So anyway, this has been Use Your Items. We very much appreciate you for sticking around. I know it was a little abridged here in the post spoiler section, but I think we got into some really interesting stuff. And if you have any feedback for us, please join us as always, as ever, on our Discord. You can find us there. You can catch me and Fran. You can tell us we need to do more. You can tell us we need to do less. You can tell us that you love us and you wish that we would do more, because guess what? We will. So that's the best place to get in touch with us. You can also reach out to us on Gmail. You can send us an email if you still like to do that sort of stuff. Use your items at gmail.com. My name is Jason. Your best luck is to find me on Discord. Or you can send me an email, I guess, to that same email. And Fran, where can they find you?
You can find me both on Threads and on Instagram at el_fantastico. That's EL, as in the Spanish article, _fantastico. I am posting there more often if you want to see such things as my top 5-starred games according to Backlogged, or that one time I saved a goat. Yeah, you can check that out. Or if you want to ask me questions there, or the Discord is both fine. Thank you all for watching, and don't forget to use your items.